As part of my seminary training, I spent a summer working as a hospital chaplain assigned to the psychiatric floor. I found it to be deeply gratifying work, and I was able to build relationships with many of the patients. Some were long-term and others had a quick turnaround. Some were what we called bouncers. These were people who would be admitted to the unit because of some behavioral issue. Oftentimes, they had just gone off their medication and needed to be stabilized, treated, and then released. But with a matter of days or weeks, they'd bounce back to the unit again. In the course of my 8 weeks at the hospital, some patients bounced several times. My favorite bouncer was Rose. Rose was a lovely woman who was about 80 years old who suffered from schizophrenia. Rose would be brought into the unit very agitated and aggressive, but within a day or so, with the proper medications, she'd be sweet as a peach. Rose and I had many long conversations about God and love and heaven, and she was rock solid in her Baptist faith. During one of our conversations, Rose expressed to me her concern about all the people who were interviewing and examining her. She was tired of being treated like a lab rat and told me that she was afraid to talk to the doctors. I tried to reassure her that they were there to help her, and I suggested that she be honest with them in answering their questions. Just be yourself, I told her, and they'll take good care of you. Rose's response to my sage advice was a priceless gem that I'll never forget. Be myself? She said, of course I've got to be myself. Everybody else is already taken. Today is the third and final sermon in our series honoring Reverend Forrest Church, the pastor of All Souls Unitarian Universalist Church in New York City for 30 years. Last month we sat with the first two parts of the mantra which he claims served him well as he faced death. Want what you have and do what you can. The third leg of this stool is equally simply stated: be who you are. Let me first give you a short refresher on the first two statements before we dive into the third. When church urges us to want what we have, he's not telling us to settle, but he's reminding us that even when things look grim, there is much to be thankful for. He uses the metaphor of a window with many panes of glass, each pane representing one of the many aspects of our lives: our health, our jobs, our relationships. When one pane gets clouded over, he tells us, we must resist the urge to press our noses against the darkened pane to the exclusion of all others. Instead, we should step back to allow the light from all the panes to filter through. Church tells us to engage in thoughtful wishing rather than wishful thinking, and thus to be grateful for all the gifts in our lives. To do what you can is to recognize both our own power and our own limitations. He writes that doing what you can means doing all you can, no more, no less. It's not just mucking by, but it's not trying to do more than you can do either, not stretching yourself out so far that you can't help but force a failure. When we do what we can, we seek to achieve the significant goals that lie within our power, and while we may risk failure, we don't set ourselves up for certain defeat. And now we find ourselves face to face with church's third admonition: be who you are. This is, he admits, the hardest task of all. Simply put, he tells us, to be who you are is not to fake your existence. He writes that each of us is unique, with unique flaws and gifts. The world doesn't owe us a living. We owe the world a living, our very own. In his book, Love and Death, Forrest Church tells of the opportunity he had as a son of a U.S. Senator Frank Church to enter politics while he was still working on his doctorate in theology. After running his father's presidential primary campaign in Nebraska, The son was ready to jump into the father's footsteps and run for public office himself. Fortunately, he listened to his father's advice to live his own life, not the life his father had led. And in doing so, writes the younger Church, I found my calling. I answered a call that was mine and not someone else's. He goes on to tell us to envy another's skills, looks, or gifts rather than embracing your own nature and call is to fail in two respects. In trying unsuccessfully to be who we aren't, we fail to become who we are. Be who you are. As Rose pointed out, it's a rather inane concept. Of course you are who you are. You are who you are because everyone else is already taken. But if it's so simple, then why do we spend so much of our lives trying to be who we're not? Trying to be like someone else, or trying to be the someone that someone else thinks or wants or makes us to believe we should be? In the words of May Sarton's poem that we heard earlier, why do we spend so much of our lives dissolved and shaken, wearing other people's faces? To be who we are born to be is no easy task. Consider for a moment our childhood and how we learn most of what we come to know. Although our intellect develops the ability to discern and debate, our most basic form of learning is emulation. Or to put it in its simplest terms, copying. Like a giant game of follow the leader, we grow up watching what others do and observing the outcomes. If we like what we see, we try to do the same in hopes of gaining a similar result. From a very early age, we are wired to be like rather than simply to be. For some of us, this message was explicit. Why can't you be more like your brother, sister, cousin, fill in the blank? Our media convinces us that to be accepted or happy or successful, we need to act in a certain way, drive a certain car, marry a member of the opposite sex. There's a reason that Rolling Stones song, Satisfaction, is still going strong some 45 years or more after its release. It speaks in part to the futility of trying to be the person that someone else thinks we should be. Like it goes. When I'm watching my TV and that man comes on and tells me how white my shirts can be, but he can't be a man because he doesn't smoke the same cigarette as me. I try and I try and I try, but I can't get no satisfaction. Role models are invaluable for us on both a societal and intellectual level. They serve to inspire us and to motivate us to consider what is possible. And there are certain traits or aspects of others that we should try to emulate. I grew up when Superman and Batman were all the rage on TV, and who can argue that we shouldn't work for truth, justice, and the American way? The danger comes, of course, when we try not just to be like our role models, but to become them. This is a recipe for disaster, a formula for failure. Neither you or I will ever be more powerful than a locomotive or capable of leaping tall buildings with a single bound. So when we try to be like Mike, we are destined for disappointment. Even if it's not superheroes or pro athletes we try to model ourselves after. In Forrest Church's case, he became close to making the mistake of trying to become like his father, the powerful Senator Frank Church of Idaho. Sometimes the influence that exert their power over us are more subtle than this. We grow up in a family of achievers, and although nothing is explicitly stated, we incorporate the message that much is expected of us. A parent's well-intentioned action sends a signal of what they hope for us, and we receive the gesture, consciously or subconsciously as a mandate. If you hear things like, "You're so good at math, you should become a scientist," enough times as a child, you're likely to believe you should become a scientist and that your passion for dance or music or social work is misplaced. By the same token, if over and over again you hear the message, "You'll never amount to anything," that too becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The forces that dictate against being who we are powerful and many. To be who we are can be like swimming upstream against a strong current of expectations and what I call the tyranny of the shoulds. And as if those forces aren't enough to defeat us, to be who we are is made all the more challenging by our lack of self-knowledge and self-awareness. Perhaps the greatest challenge to living into Forest Church's mandate to be who you are is discovering just who and what that is. Living in 21st century America, most of us are blessed with lives of comfort and relative ease, and so we can ask the question, who am I? And what do I want to be when I grow up? Many of us spend years of our lives and thousands of dollars in therapy to discover the answers to those questions. And in finding them, some of us follow the bliss, to use Joseph Campbell's term, while others, constrained by factors such as fear or family or finances, remain living a life that is not our own until our days run out. In his book, Let Your Life Speak, author and educator Parker Palmer tells of his journey of discovering his true self. He calls the true self the self planted in us by the God who made us in God's own image, the self that wants nothing more or less for us to be who we were created to be. To embark on the journey to discover this God-given self takes courage and commitment. It is risky business. It requires us to shed the masks and the costumes that populate our closets, to strip down to our naked selves and to take a close look in the mirror. There we are called to see ourselves and, perhaps more challenging yet, to claim ourselves, warts and all. Palmer put it this way: I know myself to be a person of weakness and strength, liability and giftedness, darkness and light. I know now that to be whole means to reject none of it, but to embrace all of it. That might seem like terribly narcissistic navel-gazing, but it's imperative that we discover our true selves and claim our wholeness in order to fulfill that other mandate we received from Forest Church, to do what we can. When we fail to discover our true selves, when we cling to the personae that are nothing more than the mask we wear or the fulfillment of the expectations of others, it is easy to simply remain the victims of our own conditions. We are disempowered puppets, actors playing out a script not of our own making. We blame God or our parents or our partners for our circumstances. But when we do the hard work of discovering our true and authentic selves, of claiming our whole selves, we are called to live into those selves. Embracing one's wholeness, Parker Palmer writes, makes life more demanding, because once you do that, you must live your whole life. You must, in the words of Forest Church, be who you are. The good news is that it's never too late. It's never too late to start the journey of self-discovery, of shedding the skin that we've worn since our birth that has, like an ill-fitting suit, never felt quite right. Mary Sarton is testament to this fact. When she wrote the words, "Now there is time and time is young," she was 83 years old. It was at this chronologically advanced age that she discovered her true self and finally felt her own weight and destiny. To be who we are is to offer to the world the greatest gift we can give, to invest our lives and all that we do with sincerity, authenticity, and deep commitment leads us into relationships with other authentic selves. And in entering into these relationships, relationships that are sacred in the true meaning of that word, we cannot but help bring our collective power to bear against the forces of injustice, hatred, and oppression. Our collective wholeness will, by definition, heal the world. I would like to wrap up this sermon series by telling you one more story about Forest Church. Forrest had what I consider to be a very public spiritual practice that he engaged in every week. Every Sunday, he would conclude his sermon with the words, "Amen, I love you, and may God bless us all." Just weeks before his death, he explained to his successor, Reverend Galen Gunrich, why he said, "I love you," at the end of his sermons. When I say, "I love you" from the pulpit, he told Galen, something connects. I get connected to the congregation and they get connected to each other. It's almost like, for a moment at least, we are part of each other, of something larger than ourselves. It is the human form of love divine, as Blake put it. And besides, Church went on, someone once told me that I am the only person in her life who ever says, "I love you." She comes to church to hear someone say that she matters. We all yearn to be told that we matter, that our true selves are worthy of love and capable of loving. In our common humanity, we share our vulnerabilities and our sensitivities, and we offer them up here on the altar of hope. I pray that we may find it within us each and every day to want what we have, to do what we can, and to be who we are. Amen. I love you. May God bless us all.